Hello and welcome to the first episode of Legacy's Allure, brought to you by MTG Training Grounds, the educational series dedicated to providing you with all the info on popular decks, strategies, insight, and more for the Legacy format. I am Zachary Cuck, your host. Today, I am honored to bring you a very special guest. He has quite the resume, with 2 Star City Games Open Top 8s, 2 Star City Games Invitational Top 8s, 1 Invitational win. He's a PhD candidate in differential geometry at the University of Missouri. He is an avid Storm aficionado, and I have the great pleasure of calling him my good friend. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Caleb Scherer. Caleb, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Today we're going to be talking about a deck very near and dear to your heart,
Oh,
Storm.
yeah.
We'll cover a variety of the Storm archetypes, although I know your specialty is the Ant or Ad Nauseam version. So to kick things off, why don't you tell us, what is Storm, the mechanic? How does it work? Where did it come from? The set and so on, and what does it do?
All right. Well, Storm is, like, to be technical about it, first it's a triggered ability that's tacked onto spells to where when you cast it, you will put on the stack a copy of that spell for each spell played before it that turn. So basically, if you cast 8 spells and then you cast, say a Tendrils of Agony, a card with Storm, where they lose 2 life and you gain 2 life, then you would have 9 total copies on the stack, 8 from the Storm trigger, and then 1 the original Tendrils itself. So that would be how that works. How the Storm mechanic actually functionally works. It's usually tacked onto what's kind of interesting, small effects, that just keep getting amplified, the more Storm count you have, so to say. Mm-hmm. And so, which is pretty, sweet there. So, like, for instance, there's like the common kill in Modern, which is Grape Shot, 1 damage, and then Tendrils of Agony in Legacy, which is they lose 2 life and you gain 2 life. So, small effect to start, a card that you might not think is constructed playable, and then it kind of amplifies up to an actual, like, hey, you could lose your whole life or just, take enough damage. So as far as where it came from, though, it's like the first printing of Storm was in the set Scourge, which was the 3rd set in the Onslaught block. And this is all the way back in 2003, I believe, that spring. And kind of like, as it started out, it was pretty much just busted out of the gate, too. Like, they printed such awesome cards as like Mind's Desire, which is where you shuffle your library and then reveal the top card. You can it's exiled, and then you can cast it for free with Storm. So then it's like, oh, look, I have to cast all these spells to build up to the mana to cast it, and then it's its own reward. Similarly, Tendrils of Agony was also printed in that set. Which the common kill card in Legacy, and and also Brain Freeze, which was main kill card for a while. It's since come back, a few times. So, if players haven't been playing as long as Scourge, it came back in Time Spiral block also.
So in Legacy specifically, what does a Storm deck look like? What are some of the key spells, and why are they important?
Well, in Legacy, there are a couple variants on Storm that are pretty popular, but they all do contain one engine that they all share, which is the combo of Lion's Eye Diamond, a 0 casting cost artifact that you discard your hand and sacrifice to add 3 mana, and Infernal Tutor, which is 1 in a black for a card that whenever you're hellbent, i.e. if you have no cards in hand when it resolves, then you get to Demonic Tutor. So basically you get to, cast a bunch of spells like Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, or even, Rite of Flame, something along those lines to build up, quote unquote Storm count. We'll also, assembling this with, some cantrips, say like the usual Cartel of Ponder, Brainstorm, sometimes even Preordain as well, depending on which version. And you can either go directly for an Ad Nauseam, with that tutor, to where, which is 2 black, and you keep revealing top card of your library and lose life equal to its casting cost, and do it as long as you want. So you can either draw enough cards to assemble Storm, and then tutor again for a Tendrils of Agony, the usual kill card, or sometimes you might see an Empty the Warrens. Or another way being, in some versions, you can get Past in Flames with your original tutor, which is basically a mini Yawgmoth's Will, in that it's 3 in a red for a card that gives all your instants and sorceries flashback, so all your rituals get to be cast again, and then you recast the tutor for a lethal Tendrils, usually, in that case.
All right, so to summarize, you've essentially got multiple avenues to sort of the same end. One of them
Correct.
being that you can chain or cast multiple of these ritual spells. These are all spells that generate more mana than they cost to cast, effectively
Hmm.
netting you mana at the cost of cards. And then you can cast your storm spell, assuming you had enough spells in the sequence prior. If you don't,
Correct.
you have mana production and tutoring effects that can then find you a kill card, one of the storm game enders. And if all else fails, you've got ad nauseum, which can be seen here, and is a way to draw additional cards, to sort of complete that critical mass. Or if you've already attained the critical mass and cast them, you can use Past in Flames then as a way to recast all of those spells and ultimately finish the combo that way.
Exactly.
All right. So the storm deck wins then by chaining all of these things together, and then your kill spell, which you've alluded to already, the spell Tendrils of Agony. Now you explained that drains a player for 2 life, and then you gain 2 life. And the other one you mentioned was Empty the Warrens. Now, what is special about Empty the Warrens, and why would you run that over a more direct kill, one that just drains them for the life and finishes the game right on the spot?
Well, Empty the Warrens does have some interesting applications because even in and of itself, if you cast it with, you have like quote unquote lethal storm count. If you look at it, so as we alluded with Tendrils of Agony being they lose 2 life, you gain 2 life. So if you say, oh, I have 10, if you have the 10th spell, then that would kill them. But with Empty the Warrens, since its effect is 3 in a red to put 2 1/1 goblins into play, it won't kill them right away since you'd have to wait a turn to untap and then attack with the goblins.
Right.
But it also gives you the avenue of if your storm count isn't high enough to actually kill them right away, you might be able to just have say storm of 6 and then produce 12 goblins from a Empty the Warrens, which then can kill them over multiple turns if they just can't handle a swarm of 1/1s. And also it has some synergy as well with other cards in the deck.
Okay. Now,
Mhm.
I realize that the added benefit of the goblins then is that if your opponent has some way of like, say they're untargetable due to like a Leyline of
Mhm.
Sanctity or something like that, that would
Yeah.
also that would be an avenue. Now, I'm going to skip ahead just a bit here, but there are multiple variants of Storm. So
Correct.
explain to us what the different, at least the most popular variants are, and what differs between them.
Okay, so there are 3 main variants of Storm, I'd say, throughout, where there's the Epic Storm, commonly referred to as Tess, Ad Nauseam Tendrils, commonly known as Ant, and then also one that's a little less popular here in the States, but Grinding Station, I would consider kind of the third in the kind of Storm spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
As far as how they each operate, that's different from each other. As I said earlier, they all have kind of that Infernal Tutor LED engine,
Mm-hmm.
where you have basically like build your own demonic tutors and lotuses. But kind of like where they lie is really mostly on a speed versus resiliency spectrum.
Okay.
Where, for instance, Tess being the fastest, and then Grinding Station being the slowest, and like what they'll do, in order to achieve that is, for instance, the Epic Storm will have. It also runs like all the 1-mana rituals. Like it also runs Rite of Flame and also Burning Wish as another. So it has 8 basically functional 2-mana tutors,
Okay.
and then it will almost always primarily search for either a non-lethal Empty the Warrens or an Ad Nauseam. So kind of the most common way that deck wins is just assemble 7 mana. The reason 7 because you want 2 for the initial tutor either. So like an Infernal Tutor, and then 5 floating to cast the Ad Nauseam itself. And you can usually win from even no mana in your mana pool pretty confidently. Or, assemble and Empty the Warrens for like, 12 goblins, hoping that's just good enough because you're commonly doing that on turn 1, maybe turn 2 at the latest.
Okay.
And then like kind of the next one is what I always play, which is Ant or Ad Nauseam Tendrils,
Mm-hmm.
where you forego all of almost all the red cards, and you don't run any. You, instead of running like Rite of Flame, you run Cabal Rituals, so you have slightly slower but much more powerful rituals. Since
Mm-hmm.
Cabal Ritual it costs 1 and a black to add 3 black, but if you have Threshold, so 7 cards in your graveyard, you get to add 5 black. So it effectively nets you 3 mana, which
Mhm.
is almost, like build your own Black Lotus out of an instant, which is sweet. And basically, then what you can be much more focused on is a balance between getting an ad nauseum kill, which is kind of more of a backup plan for that deck, versus the usual quote unquote past in flames kill, where you cast a couple ritual effects, say a dark ritual and a cabal ritual, then sacrifice an LED in response to your infernal tutor to grab past in flames so you can recast everything, and then cast a tendrils of agony. So also in this deck, since you don't have wish, you are also killing with tendrils of agony almost every single time, versus where we saw with what I explained with Tess was they would have an empty the warrens kill much more often. Another thing that's slightly different about And is since they're also more on this, black mana and assemble a past in flames style kill, you start running dark petitions. So what you can do is, have functional like 6 quote unquote infernal tutors or demonic tutors. So that's kind of the main gist there. Then the third, being Grinding Station, is the slowest of the whole all 3 decks, where they kind of have, again, much more reliant on the past in flames engine. Usually, sometimes skewing ad nauseum entirely is very common in the main deck, to just have 4 infernal tutors to search up a past in flames kill, and also running usually multiple empty the warrens and multiple tendrils of agony in the main, since kind of a big thing that those decks try to do, prey on miracles more often, since that is usually a big weakness for the other 2 variants, is by just having a quote unquote natural tendrils kill, which is where you instead of having, as we said before, to tutor for the tendrils, you just naturally draw 9 spells, beforehand, and then cast the tendrils as your 10th spell and you're done, which you can also do through a countertop lock and stuff like that. So that's kind of the difference between all 3 versions as far as like their speed spectrum versus resiliency in all of these.
Okay, so now that we know the different variants of Storm, let's focus on the one that you're most familiar with, the ad nauseum tendrils variant. What decks is this Storm deck best against? Like, what are its strengths? You said it has more resiliency, but let's go into more detail there.
Its biggest strength is that its greatest matchup, most fast combo, which is, hey, if you're not running Force of Will, as long as you're not a mud deck, pretty much. But as far as the resiliency goes, is since you also have you have a longer game plan with past in flames, so you can sometimes just kind of trudge along and grind them out for a few turns with discard spells, and then you reuse everything over, even if they're destroying your hand with, say, Hymn to Torok or Thoughtseize of their own, as well. Versus where Tess doesn't have that built-in resiliency. But it does have more speed, since it has the lower cost rituals and stuff.
Okay, so you said you are best against decks that are either reliant on Force of Will and those kind of permissions counter spells, or decks that have none of those at all. But
yeah.
Okay, so what decks are really good against Storm then? What is it weak to?
Probably its weakest matchups, I would say, are Mud is really, really hard for you, since they're pretty.
Mud is the mono artifact sort of prison deck.
Exactly. So yeah, the one with like 4 lodestone golems, 4 metal workers, 4 trinispheres. So anything that can come down in turn 1 and make it so there's no way you're going to be able to cast 10 spells in 1 turn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chalice of the Void as well, right? Which is
Chalice. Yeah,
has recently become a very popular card, both in Legacy and in Modern.
Oh yeah, the card is insanely powerful. I would say that's a matchup for us. Also, the new 4-color loam decks are pretty awkward to play against. Like, for instance, like the one that beat me in the finals in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
That deck is surprisingly, since it's so diversified in its threats against Storm. Mm-hmm. And then also, I'd say Miracles is it's not a awful matchup in any way, but it's definitely the hardest, which makes it also, I think, pretty fun. But
Okay. So
Mhm.
if you're one of these decks that Storm seeks to prey on, right, like in a lot of
Mhm.
cases, I assume this is like elves, death and taxes, decks like all the Delver variants, the ones that are trying to
Yeah.
apply pressure while also having some permission. What should those decks do to fight back against Storm? Like what are good sideboard cards against Storm?
Well, against Storm, pretty much the best. If you're just looking for single cards, like kind of like variant to beat, like Storm, permanent base like hate bears are really really good. Since a lot of those will stop me from actually getting to play Magic. Like for instance, like out of uh, some decks you can run like Gaddock Teague, so I can't win the game while that's happening, or Aethersworn Canonist. Those are great. But if you don't, just want to go straight up for hate there, the best way is to attack on multiple axes at the same time. Like for instance, like counter if you're attacking me with counter spells and hand disruption, then I can't just assemble the perfect hand, then wait to overcome you since you're also proactively attacking my way to build up. Or if you're crushing my life total and like uh, with sorry, also having counter spells, attacking me, and also graveyard hate being another axis as well. So basically, life total, graveyard, discard, permanent, and counter magic. So if you can attack from like 2 to 3 of those angles, then you can actually be in good shape versus Storm. You don't have to have certain extreme dedicated pieces of hate. Like a lot of people just default to the 4 Mindbreak Trap plan or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
While that card is good against us, don't get me wrong. But if you have something like diversified like that and you're attacking multiple axes, I can't build a game plan since Storm is pretty malleable to just like circumvent the one really strong area you're attacking me on right now. Like for instance, I think that like Grafdigger's Cage is a very mediocre piece of hate against Storm if you're kind of like reliant on it for your draw. It's a good additional nail in the coffin. That well,
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty funny, but
No pun
yeah, so like
intended.
kind of like that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so assuming a player has things like some hand disruption and maybe some permanent based hate, we'll say some of the like Thalia or
Mm-hmm.
Gaddock Teague or something like that. What does a Storm deck typically have in its arsenal to try and fight back against the hate? What's the counter hate? What are you typically trying to use to protect yourself or to force your combo to happen?
Well, out of our sideboard, we usually have. So if you have more permanent based hate, but you don't have Force of Will or any other counters, then we also have like Disfigure and or Chain of Vapor, which Disfigure being 1 black to give a creature -2/-2, or Chain of Vapor, which is 1 blue to return a non-land permanent, which also can be copied. So there is some other hidden synergies in the deck there. So those are usually like kind of the main offenders against like like usually like Thalia decks like Death and Taxes and stuff, or even out of Burn where they have like Eidolon, the Great Rebel, we'd have something of that nature since we can
Mm-hmm.
just end of turn use one of those effects, so it's either dead or off the board in your hand, and I can just kill you since I don't have to worry about you countering that spell. But if say you do have permanent based hate and counter spells, we have Abrupt Decay and a tropical island either in the main or sideboard to pay for the green, since that's green and a black, to destroy any non-land permanent with CMC 3 or less, which is usually every hate piece, and can't be countered, which is very helpful.
Right. And given the speed of Storm, it seems like if a hate piece has to be susceptible to abrupt decay in order for it to be fast enough to actually be effective. So that seems like a very good counter to their counter. Um,
Exactly.
okay. All right. So now that we've covered sort of what Storm is, how it functions, how it sideboards, etc. Um, tell me what kind of a player does it take to play Storm? Like what is the personality type that should probably best be suited to that?
Basically, the best thing is if you really, really love puzzles. Mainly because pretty much every game is just this very interesting puzzle. Since you're not really a combo deck that goes, oh, I like say for instance Show and Tell, where it's I just need to cast Show and Tell and then put in a giant object, or permanent of some kind,
Mm-hmm.
and it just assembles. Like this, it's like, and it's a very different combination of cards every time. So you're like, oh, so you're always having to do a lot of math to kind of work stuff around. So, a lot of times, sometimes it can be, pretty easy and formulaic, but, that's kind of the person, like what you're doing a lot. So you're always like, oh, I can almost always see a solution. So kind of like that, like, because like basically the biggest limitation to playing Storm is yourself. So,
Right,
uh,
I've heard it described that way a lot of times, where Storm players or Storm decks will
yeah.
lose to themselves just as often as they will lose to whatever their opponent did, especially with a less skilled player.
Oh, yes, definitely.
So given that, would you say that there is a high skill barrier or learning curve to Storm?
I would say like as far as like doing well and like say if you want to go to the stars like a Star City Open or something like that or even just a classic, what you'll want to do is put in a lot of months beforehand because like there's kind of a huge barrier in that not only do you have to know how to play in a format like okay what cards are legal like if you sit down for standard, but you also have to know exactly how your deck will function at all times since even if your opponent literally does nothing for 5 turns and you miscount your mana on the turn you go off, you have nothing left, and you just pass turn and then slowly die to say like any random like Dryad Arbor or something.
Okay,
So it's like you have both of those skill. You have to kind of get like up to a certain level of proficiency on 2 levels. As that as well, since not only do you have to know how to play around like just in general, that's like we do with normal Magic. You can just fall like a house of cards if you don't have kind of all the numbers down pat.
okay, so you would definitely recommend a lot of play testing and practice with the deck ahead of time, and also maybe not selecting the deck unless you're the type of person who really wants to put in a lot of mental energy.
Yeah.
It's not a fluid deck gameplay wise. Like you're not play things as they show up and deploy your threats in the order you expect them to. This is a very thinking man's everything's in your hand
Oh
style.
yeah. So definitely, and I guess one other thing as far as preparation is you can never goldfish enough with this deck. Like I know I still goldfish this deck all the time to keep learning new things. So it's like kind of also a nice, even though like the skill barrier there is really high as far as testing, you also get the advantage of being able to just jam goldfish games and actually be really learning a lot versus like something more interactive like Miracles where it'd be a lot harder to do so.
Right. I can definitely see the value of goldfishing with Storm versus something like a Delver deck where your counter spells really have to have legitimate targets for you to ever visualize how you'd be casting them and when. I've noticed that with some of the decks I've played that like if they're very interactive, it's very hard to goldfish. But decks that are a little more a puzzle in themselves and sort of proactive but not reactive, yeah, you can definitely get a little more value out of goldfishing. So you've had plenty of goldfish games where I'm sure sitting in your apartment, but how about games of Legacy you've played with Storm that actually had an opponent? Do you have a favorite, or is there a certain type of story you'd like to tell us? Something fun that happened?
Probably one of my favorite games with it was in Indianapolis. So like the first game I actually got to play on camera for with Storm itself was in like my semifinals match versus Ben Weinberg, and it was the mirror match, and he gets to go turn 1 duress, or no, not duress, but probe Cabal Therapy, and I reveal my hand. He takes the correct card, and I get to untap, draw step, kill him anyway. As my first game on the draw in the mirror match. So
So a turn 1 kill despite his disruption was all.
yeah, I mean it was just like I mean like it was just like kind of funny because it was also like the first kind of game I ever got to play on camera with it. So like for me it was just kind of funny.
Now I did not realize that was your first time on camera. I know you've been playing Magic for a long time, and I assume Legacy for a long time as well, but I did not realize that was your debut, because I believe that was also my debut on Star City's feature matches as well. I had the match right before that against Jim Davis, where ultimately I lost, but it was it's fun nonetheless. So let's talk about your Star City Invitational win. You weren't playing Storm there because the formats were standard and modern. Yet you still chose as your winning token to make a storm counter, and that is now the token or the giveaway at the Open Series events. So tell us why you chose that, although that seems somewhat obvious, and what does having this token mean to you now?
Well, of course, I chose this because Storm is pretty much, I've played with the deck, most of the time since it's been, legal, which is in 2003, whenever I've been playing. So it's always been a big favorite of mine in all the Eternal formats. So it's kind of like, well, I have to do this. And plus, like, even now, like, pretty most of my success being with Storm in the past year as well, other than this Invitational.
I don't think anybody questions your decision.
Oh yeah.
I assume it has very special meaning to you. That's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah. But I mean, like, it's just like, as far as like meaning, it's just like super awesome to also, just being part of like the Storm community and just leaving a mark and stuff is also just awesome.
No, I'm envious. If I ever got the chance, I would love to do something similar.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Caleb, it has been a pleasure talking to you. I'm very glad you were able to join us today. Thank you for your time and giving us this in-depth look at the Storm archetype.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Zach.
All right, no problem. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. It has been my pleasure to bring you this episode of Legacies Allure. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and feel free to leave us feedback on our YouTube page, or you can message me directly at mtgtraininggrounds@gmail.com. I am your host, Zachary Cook.